everyone, and thank you for joining us in our study of Genesis chapter 14. I was in a checkout line in the store the other day, and I noticed that my watch had fallen off my wrist at some point. I started looking around on the floor, and then I saw it underneath the foot of the man that was behind me. Now, he was having a heated discussion with his wife at the moment, and I didn't want to interrupt them. So I thought, I'll wait until that they're done talking. Well, after several minutes, the argument grew worse, and I just wanted to get my watch out from under his shoe and then get out of there. And then all of a sudden, he pushes her and gives her a shove. That's when I decided to step in and intervene. Nobody lays their hands on a female, not on my watch. Okay, I'm kidding. That was just a joke. We are called to be people of peace. The Bible tells us to forgive. It tells us to turn the other cheek. And as much as possible on our part, get along with all men. But there are times that the Bible also calls for conflict. There's times that the Bible calls for war. Suppose you're in a situation like that one I just mentioned in that joke a while ago. What would you do? How far would things have to go before it and escalate before you stepped in to protect someone who is unable to protect themselves or is too scared to defend themselves? Would you even do anything at all? James 4 verse 17 says, "Therefore to the one who knows the right thing to do and does not do it, to him it is sin." Now, Abram, whom we've been talking about for several chapters now, he is a man of peace. But when the chips are down and a family member has been wronged, this man of God is going to step up and do something. Or is he just going to walk away and say, "I'll pray for you," like some people nowadays would? We're going to see how Abram's going to respond to just such an occasion in this chapter, and we'll also see how the whole situation could have been avoided in the first place. And to top it off, we will also meet a very interesting and intriguing person in this chapter that we don't know very much about, but the things that we do know will captivate your imagination and wonder. So in Genesis 14, let us begin with verses 1 through 4. "And it came about in the days of Amraphel, king of Shinar, Arioch, king of Eleazar, Chedorlaomer, king of Elam, and Tidal, king of Goim, that they made war with Bera, king of Sodom, and with Bersha, king of Gomorrah, Shinob, king of Admah, and Shemember, king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, that is Zoar. And all of these came as allies to the valley of Siddim, that is the Salt Sea. 12 years they had served Chedorlaomer, but in the 13th year they rebelled." Verse 1 here gives us a timestamp that's going to set the pattern for the rest of the Old Testament. Now, they didn't number their years like those of us on this side of the cross do. They often made reference to who was the king during the time of the events that were discussed. Kind of like us if we would use presidents to refer to an era of time. Oh, back in George Washington days, late 1700s. Or in Abraham Lincoln's days, you would think in the 1860s. Or the Bill Clinton era. You would think of the early 1990s and such. Now, of course, Israel, or Abram's people at the time, hadn't even become a nation. They had no king to make reference to, for the nation was still just one old man and his wife. So we were given the names in these verses of the kings of all of these other nations. So what we have here is the first recorded war in the Bible, other than the war against humanity by Satan and our nonstop battle with sin, of course. We have 4 kings that are the descendants of Ham versus 5 kings that are the descendants of Shem. Now, knowing the temperament of Sodom and Gomorrah, you might be shocked to hear that they are actually Shemites. Not every person in the lineage of Shem was good, and not everyone from the family of Ham was bad. Add to that, these people are not the ones listed in the previous genealogies that eventually lead to Christ incarnate. Every one of the names of the generations of Shem mentioned says that they had other sons and daughters. Well, these are the other sons and daughters. They're related to Abraham, but not by much. What's important here is not these unpronounceable names. Good luck with these if you're following along. Maybe that's why they're so cranky. They're madder than a boy named Sue, if you had a name like Chedorlaomer. The focus of this setting is the war. We have 4 kings from the east coming against 5 kings from the west. Now, when we say the word kings here, it's in a loose sense. We're not talking about entire countries or entire nations as we know them today, although Iraq and Persian territories are among those listed here. Rather, think of them as rulers or kings over vast city-states. That's evident when you read that Sodom had a different king than Gomorrah. We're talking cities. We're not talking entire nations. Many things that occur in the Bible are a foreshadow of things that are to come, and this one is no different. In fact, this chapter has at least two major things or people that foreshadow future events. These four kings have either previously conquered the five Semitic ones or had threatened to 14 years before this happened. Many times, if a country promised to pay an annual tribute to a more powerful nation, that nation would leave them alone. Many years later, this is going to happen again to some of the promised descendants of Abram. The people of Israel are going to be forced to pay a tribute to the kingdom of Assyria for quite a lengthy time. But apparently, these nations had enough of that schoolyard bully demanding their lunch money every year. Verse 4 tells us for 12 years, they paid that bully their lunch money. They paid tribute. And in the 13th year, they said, that's enough. No more. What are you going to do about it? Well, of course, in real life, 9 times out of 10, the bully is going to use his fist when you refuse, as we're going to see in these verses that we've read. But these events that we are about to read about must have influenced a future descendant of Abram by the name of Hezekiah, who would be a king of Israel. For he realized that no matter how big the bully is, if God is on your side, you can stand against him. Hezekiah rebelled against Assyria. But let us see how things turned out for these brave nations that are not walking so closely with God, if they even walked with God at all. We'll go ahead and get verses 5 through 10. In the 14th year, Chedorlaomer and the kings that were with him came and defeated the Rephaim and Ashtaroth Karnaim, and the Zuzim in Ham, and the Emim in Shavev Kiriathaim, and the Horites in the Mount Seir as far as El Paran, which is by the wilderness. Then they turned back and came to En Mishpat, that is Kadesh, and conquered all the country of the Amalekites, and also the Amorites who lived in Hazazon Tamar. And the king of Sodom, and the king of Gomorrah, and the king of Admah, and the king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, that is Zoar, came out, and they arrayed for battle against them in the valley of Siddim, against Chedorlaomer, king of Elam, and Tidal, king of Goim, and Amraphel, king of Shinar, and Arioch, king of Elasar, 4 kings against 5. Now the valley of Siddim was full of tar pits, and the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah fled, and they fell into them. But those who survived fled to the hill country. Now that was a mouthful of names. I've studied and dabbled a little bit in the Hebrew language, but if you're a scholar and you're proficient in it, please forgive me for butchering those names. I did the best I could. The day of battle came, and the bullies won, but we should really feel sympathetic for those that were conquered, or should we? Perhaps their military loss was a form of judgment. Maybe it's because of their wicked behavior that this happened. Though they were not the aggressors here, they're not the ones extorting for this tribute money. They were not saints themselves. They're not the good guys, as we would say. Warren Wiersbe stated that might be why the 5 kings were defeated on their home turf by 4 invading kings. Perhaps the lifestyle of the people of Sodom and Gomorrah did not prepare them for conflict. It certainly made them ripe for judgment. So imagine the scene now. It might be 4 armies against 5, but the 4 were experienced. They're battle-ready soldiers, men who really knew what they were doing. They had experienced victory after victory. Then we get to verse 8 that says, and the king of Sodom and the king of Gomorrah and the king of Admah, the king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela came out, and they arrayed for battle against them. Knowing what we know about Sodom and Gomorrah, when it says they were arrayed for battle, that could possibly mean they came out in spectacular dresses and they wore flats instead of high heels. Maybe instead of swords, they had their purses filled with rocks. I don't know. I'm sorry. But they are coming out against an army that has been battle tested and experienced repeated victories. And in short, it didn't go well for Sodom and Gomorrah and those fellow kings of theirs. Verses 5 through 9 paint the picture of a lopsided war. They ended up chasing these western city-states all over the territory from one end to the other. And again, I wonder what Abram's wife Sarai had to think about all of this. First, you drag me out to this barren land that we don't even own. Don't even get me started on what happened in Egypt. And look, now the neighbors are squabbling and killing each other. David Guzik mentioned an archaeologist who has actually seen the aftermath of this war of 4 against 5. Archaeologist Nelson Gluck documented the destruction left by these kings, and he said, and I quote, "Every village in their path had been plundered and left in ruins. The countryside was laid waste. The population had been wiped out or led away into captivity. For hundreds of years thereafter, the entire area was like an abandoned cemetery. It was hideously unkempt, with all of its monuments shattered and strewn about in pieces on the ground." End quote. Verse 10 tells us that not all the deaths came at the hand of enemy soldiers. Many of them fell into tar pits that were nearby. I imagine, it was a worse fate than being run through with a sword if you think about it. But a significant amount of people must have fell into these things for them to be mentioned there, these tar pits. But this leads us to another interesting tidbit. When Sodom and Gomorrah are going to be judged in the future, how does God destroy that city? He called down fire from heaven. What happens when you mix fire with petroleum products? An entire area gets leveled in moments. That's what happens. Verse 10 also mentions that there were a few survivors that fled to the hills. Evidently, the king of Sodom was one of them, because he's going to make a later appearance a little bit further in this chapter. Let us continue on and get verses 11 and 12. Then they took all the goods of Sodom and Gomorrah and all their food supply and departed. They also took Lot, Abram's nephew, and his possessions and departed, for he was living in Sodom. All of that rebellion of these 5 kings was for nothing. The bully's going to get his lunch money one way or another. He just had to rally up his buddies and come and conquer the land. It required more effort, so naturally he's going to take far more than what the tribute was going to be. He just took everything. Just like a bad renter that leaves a rent house, everything that's not nailed down was taken, and even some things that were nailed down. I once had a tiny 1-bedroom house that I started out in, and later I sold it on a rent-to-own basis. I priced it really cheap, hoping to help some people get out and get ahead in life. But with cheap prices comes shady renters, and 7 of them broke the contract by not paying. Now, I expected light bulbs and furniture to be taken. I wasn't too surprised when some of the people rolled up the carpet and took that. Not even when the chain link fence was stolen, but the real shocker came when someone tore down and stole the 2-car metal carport that I had included with the building. The kings of the east, they also took everything. They took the surviving people that they could catch. They took every possession that could be transported. They even took all of the food, so if anyone who went into hiding up in the mountains had nothing to come home to. Think of the magnitude of this looting. All of the belongings of the people of Admah, the stuff belonging to the people of Zeboim, and of the people of the nation of Zoar. But I think it's Sodom and Gomorrah that had the most loot, because verse 12 says they took a lot. Forgive me, I can't help myself. Let's continue on into verses 13 through 16. Then a fugitive came and told Abraham the Hebrew. Now he was living by the oaks of Mamre the Amorite, brother of Eshol, the brother of Aner, and these were the allies with Abram. When Abram heard that his relative had been taken captive, he led out his trained men, born in his house, 318, and went in pursuit as far as Dan. He divided his forces against them by night, he and his servants, and defeated them, and pursued them as far as Hobah, which is north of Damascus. He brought back all of the goods and also brought back his relative Lot with his possessions, and also the women and the people. So when the news of what happens reaches Abram's ears, I think that if it had just been the nations, Abraham would have felt bad for the people, but not really stirred into action. He knows what kind of wickedness goes on in those places, and he also knows that God did not approve. So he might have just chalked it up, well, deserved judgment. They had this coming. But it got personal when they told him about his nephew Lot. And I hate to be the one that points this out, but Lot was not supposed to be there. Lot was supposed to stay back in Ur when God called Abram to come to Canaan. They would have even been better off leaving him in Haran. God told Abram, leave your family behind except for your wife. This decision and that partial obedience is going to lead to consequences, and guess who just knocked at the flap of Abram's tent? Consequences. Abram's a man of nearly 80 years old by this point. He should be fishing somewhere. He should be taking it easy, but now he has to go to war against a four-nation confederacy that are all experienced warriors. We do see that Abram had some allies of his own. Verse 13 names them. And you might wonder, why did Abram, a man of God, make friends with the people of the land? This is what got Lot into trouble, isn't it? Actually, Lot would have been better off staying in his tents far from the city. Even better in Ur, but at least stay far away from Sodom and Gomorrah. By the time we get to this chapter, it says Lot had moved into the city. We see later on that Lot is a well-known citizen. If you're going to associate yourself with the lawless people that are sowing wickedness in this world, don't be surprised when you get swallowed up in the consequences that they reap. I think the court system today calls that guilty by association. Lot may not have been doing the things that the men of that city were doing, but Lot was in that city when judgment came upon it. So you might question, why does Abram have friends with the people that's there? But first you got to acknowledge Abram didn't live with them. Abram just lived next to them, on the outskirts of them. It might be true, but we got to be careful not to compromise and not to join the lost in their sinfulness. But at the same time, we got to care for people and help others by being a shining light in the darkness. You have to reach the lost, but you don't have to live with the lost. When you see someone broken down on the side of the road and you happen to find someone walking on a hiking trail, they got a broken leg or whatever, do you ask either one of them for their testimony first? Well, if they confess they don't know the Lord, are you going to hand that hiker and say, well, here's a Bible, you're not going anywhere for a while, go ahead and get to know God? Or if you ask the person on the side of the road, what's your testimony? If they're not a Christian, say, oh, well, you should have been and drive off. No, you don't do that. Of course not. One has to be salt and light in order to aid the others with their burdens. And when you help them, that might open ears that were formerly locked up tight when it comes to hearing the gospel. Just don't move in with them. Don't become wrapped up in their culture. Don't become a part of their ways. Abraham was separated, but not isolated. He was independent, but not indifferent. Verse 14 tells us that Abram had 318 men trained and ready for combat from his own servants. But since it listed these allies earlier, they might have also lent a hand with some men. But 318 of them were born in Abram's household. So it kind of makes you wonder, how many servants did this guy have? If you included women and children and the elderly that couldn't go to war, it must have been up in the thousands. And you might also be wondering, why is this nomadic shepherd having his own personal army? Well, also think about all the wealth Abram has. More animals than the land could possibly handle, more silver and gold than you could count, and hundreds, if not thousands, of servants. He is in a land full of wicked people. There's no law enforcement. There's no firearms. How else would a man with Abram's wealth hang on to all of it? How would he resist looters? No doubt that somewhere along the way, some men were trained just in case that someone came through there to attack them and to rob them. After all, most shepherds are used to fighting lions and bears and other critters that try to take the livestock. You might as well be ready to defend against human predators while you're at it. Now, I'm not sure how many soldiers were in that four-army coalition, but you can guarantee it was more than 318. But of course, if God is with you, who can stand against you? Throughout the Bible, God has often used small forces to gain big victories. Many times, He would even send a lot of people home so that only a few remained to battle. That way, when the victory comes, they can't say that they won because of their own strength or their own might. Everybody will know that God did that, and to Him the glory will go, as it should. Abram was also smart. In verse 15 it says he split up his troops. He even went in under cover of night to gain an advantage. And add to that, these guys likely didn't expect anybody to come after them. I mean, they're the biggest dogs in the park after all. Who's going to come up and put a fight against them? A five-nation coalition just failed. And I like how Abram was right there in the mix with them. He wasn't staying somewhere safe in the distance, commanding his men to fight. Verse 15 said he and his servants. Now you might be wondering about the names of some of these places too. I'm not sure how old Damascus is or when it was founded, but Dan was named after one of the tribes of Israel, which would be one of Abram's great-grandsons who wasn't born yet. We got to remember that the first 5 books of the Bible were written by Moses, likely by direct revelation from God. When these events happened, it was just a place up in the far north where the enemy was pursued. In Abram's time, it probably didn't even have a name. But from the perspective of Moses, and for the sake of those who would read this, we are told that that is now called Dan. Today, I know a lot of old-timers who use places that no longer exist to make references. They'll say, you go down and turn left where the old Woolworths used to be. It's right across the street from the old Montgomery Ward's building, 3 doors down from Sears and Roebuck's. Most younger people probably never even heard of these stores. Well, here, Moses was using the opposite way of describing locations, and that's a lot more effective. He says, you know that region in which the tribe of Dan settled? That's where Abram pursued these guys. So that's why we have the name Dan there. In fact, in the old city, which is called Tel Dan, T-E-L Dan, there is a place there that's called Abraham's Gate, for that is where he entered and ventured into Dan with his army. That gate is one of the oldest, if not the oldest, remaining gate in the world, at least 4,000 years old. I'll put a picture of it up on the screen. The gate is built from mud brick, and therefore they had to cover it to prevent this thing from falling apart. Abram gave chase for a distance of about 100 miles, and he won the battle. Verse 16 tells us how he regained everything that the enemy had taken from everyone. He was only there for his nephew, but other people had suffered loss, and Abram was going to make sure that their stuff got taken back to them, including the family members who were taken captive. He could have done just a little strategic strike and get Lot pulled out of there and left everyone else behind, but he didn't. Don't you know that this was a prime opportunity to give glory to God instead of just making a name for yourself and keeping all of this loot for yourself? So let us see if Abram's faith has matured any since that fiasco in Egypt. Let us go ahead and read verses 17 through 20. Then after his return from the defeat of Chedorlaomer and the kings that were with him, the king of Sodom went out to meet him at the valley of Shaveh, that is, the king's valley. And Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. Now he was a priest of God Most High. He blessed him and said, Blessed be Abram of God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth. And blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand. He gave him 1/10 of all. Here we have the not-so-brave and valiant king of Sodom that had fled earlier. He's come back to rule over the rubble that was left behind. I imagine the sigh of relief of that king and all of those who were with him when they saw those people coming back. There's this long line of people returning, family members and all of their belongings. It had to be a joyous time, even after so much loss of life in the battle. So Abram was a hero in their eyes, and it should have have made them give glory to God. Well, that did happen for one such person that captures and intrigues the imagination of any serious Bible student. Verse 18 says, "And Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. Now he was a priest of God Most High." Reading on in the next two verses, this man really knew and worshipped the same God of Abram. But the question that might pop into your head is, did this text just call this guy a priest? We're still at least 500 or 600 years before the priesthood was given to Aaron and his descendants. So what's going on here? Who is this guy? There are tons of books and all kinds of videos out there that try to make something out of this guy that he just is not. To avoid doing the same, let's look at the best commentary there is on the Bible itself. David spoke of this man in one of the Messianic Psalms. In Psalm 110, it mentions a king that would come and judge the nations and make his enemies a footstool under his feet. And then this mysterious guy is mentioned there. In Psalm 110, verse 4, "The Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek." Then we have the author of the book of Hebrews pick up on this example in chapters 5, 6, and 7 of the book of Hebrews. And there he describes the perfect high priest. So we'll start with the part in Hebrews chapter 5. It's verses 9 and 10. "And having been made perfect, he became to all those who obey him the source of eternal salvation, being designated by God as a high priest according to the order of Melchizedek." Then chapter 6 mention of him in verses 19 and 20. "This hope we have as an anchor of the soul, a hope both sure and steadfast, one which enters within the veil, where Jesus has entered as a forerunner for us, having become a high priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek." And then in chapter 7, almost in the entire chapter is about the same thing. So I won't quote all of chapter 7 in the interest of time, but you would be blessed to take a note of this and read it later at home in your spare time. But here are some of the interesting things it says in Hebrews 7. We'll just skip the first 3 verses. "For this Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the Most High God, who met Abraham as he is returning from the slaughter of the kings and blessed him, to whom Abraham apportioned a 10th part of all the spoils, was first of all, by translation of his name, King of Righteousness, and then also King of Salem, which is King of Peace, without father, without mother, without genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but made like the Son of God, he remains a priest perpetually." We see that this mysterious guy was a king of Salem, which would later become the city of Jerusalem. Salem being the same as Shalom. So technically the place was called Peace. The name Melchizedek means King of Righteousness. Now it's been said that without mother and without father and without genealogy, that doesn't mean that this man was born somehow without earthly parents. Rather, to a Jewish nation that took painstaking efforts recording their own heritage, tracing themselves all the way back to Adam, this guy was an enigma. They can trace themselves not to him. They couldn't trace this guy to anybody else. We see in the Gospels that Jesus could be traced all the way back to Adam. And everything's so complete were these records prior to the temple destroyed in AD 70 that any Jewish person could do that. Today, nobody knows and nobody can prove their lineage. Most cannot even recall which tribe they are from. So this man was even more mysterious in the fact that he appears untraceable with no genealogy, no records, because he is not in the lineage of Messiah. He was also of the sons and daughters of Shem. And even more mysterious than that's the fact that he appears in the most unexpected place in Scripture, the most unexpected place in the world. He can't be traced anywhere but here in chapter 14, apparently not too far from Sodom and Gomorrah. People have wondered for years, how did this man come to know the one true God in the midst of a wicked nation? He has never met Abram or any of Abram's servants prior to this. And how was a priesthood developed long before God ordained it before the brother of Moses, before he gave it to Aaron? Just how did Melchizedek come to know and believe and serve the creator of the universe? We're not told for sure, but if I was to make an educated guess, and this is just a guess, I would assume it's probably the same way that Abram did. God probably revealed himself to him. On that note, I wonder if Melchizedek and the people of Salem were just as confused as this when this obscure old man who lived in a tent in Canaan, how did he come to know the same God that they know? Is it a small world or just a mighty big God? I can remember the culture shock I felt on my first mission trip. Having never left my own country before, I was surprised to see the faith not only alive, but thriving better than it is in my own country. We often think that our own country, whatever it may be, you think that yours is the only one serving God. But yet you cross the border into another country and sometimes you will see a bigger hunger and thirst for the word than you can see in your own country. Our God is a mighty big God, and we may not realize it yet, but we have brothers and sisters all over this globe. We just haven't met them yet. But back to this Melchizedek guy. Whoever wrote Hebrews understood the significance of him. He knew what this guy was, the type of one who was to come. The order of the priesthood that was given to the descendants of Aaron was flawed, because everybody that took after that was flawed. Everybody that come from Aaron was a sinner. Everyone sins. Everyone dies. Every high priest that served Israel eventually had to be replaced because he died. And every high priest has to make sin offerings for himself and for his family before he can even begin to intercede on behalf of the people. Now, to be clear, this Melchizedek guy, he is also a sinner. I'm certain everybody but Jesus was, because my Bible tells me so. But what made this guy unique is who he represented, who he was a foreshadow of. To put this another way, as we went through the book of Daniel, there were many prophecies that portrayed the actions of the coming Antichrist. But if you'll remember, there was a man we talked about in the book of Daniel that came in the time between the Old and the New Testaments, and he fulfilled some of those wicked things. Most of those prophecies in Daniel were dual fulfillment prophecies. Things that would happen in the near future and things that will happen in the distant future on a bigger scale. Many of the things of the future Antichrist that he is going to do was done by a guy who was a sneak preview. He was a foreshadow of the coming evil one, Antiochus Epiphanes, Antiochus IV. He's not the ultimate evil guy, but he was a living example of the bigger fulfillment that is still to come. Melchizedek, who we're talking about here, is not Jesus. He is not a pre-incarnate visit from Jesus, but many people are just led to think that he is. Rather, we can be certain that he was a living example. He is a foreshadow of the coming Prince of Peace, of the coming King of Righteousness, the coming High Priest that will be permanent. Many of the things were foreshadows of Christ in the Old Testament. You got the bronze serpent that was lifted up in the wilderness, and everybody that looked to that looked forward to Christ being lifted up on a pole to heal the nations. The bronze serpent wasn't the Messiah. It was a foreshadow looking forward to Messiah. The sacrifices at the temple, the Passover lambs that were slaughtered year after year, were examples of the perfect Lamb of God that would take away the sin of the world. All of those Passover lambs were not the Messiah. They were a foreshadow of the one to come. Melchizedek was an example or a foreshadow of Christ. Melchizedek had untraceable roots. Now, the Bible gives us a lineage of Jesus's earthly roots, but that was at his incarnation. Remember, Jesus existed before the foundation of the world, so therefore he has no relatives other than the Father. Just like Melchizedek was one of the only ones to ever hold the office of both priest and king, Jesus is both our king and our high priest. No one else was permitted to be both in the Bible. Some have tried to assume the responsibilities of both, and they got in trouble for doing so. Now, Melchizedek, he brought out bread and wine to Abram, the same things that would be used to establish the new covenant that Jesus set up after the Last Supper. But the thing that Jesus sets apart from the high priest, or both the Aaronic order and the order of Melchizedek, the sinlessness of Jesus and the eternality of Jesus. That's what sets him apart from all of those high priests. That's what sets him apart from Melchizedek. In Hebrews chapter 7, verses 26 through 28, it says, "For it was fitting for us to have such a high priest, holy, innocent, undefiled, separated from sinners, and exalted above the heavens, who does not need daily, like those high priests, to offer up sacrifices, first for his own sins, then for the sins of the people, because this he did once for all when he was offered up himself. For the law appoints men as high priests who are weak, but the word of the oath, which came after the law, appoints a son, made perfect forever." So we have there a distinction between Christ and Melchizedek. Melchizedek was a lot of things, but he wasn't those things that we just read there in chapter 7. Before we move on, I want to take a note of this little blessing contest going on between Abram and Melchizedek. The priest blessed Abram with his spiritual resources. Abram blessed him in return with his material resources. Abram gave him a tithe of all he had, not 10% of what he made that week, not 10% of what he gained in Egypt, 10% of everything. Now that's quite substantial considering the wealth of Abram. But what I want us to look at is the effect of meeting and fellowshipping with another believer outside of the family, what effect that had on Abram. So let's go ahead and look at verses 21 through 24. The king of Sodom said to Abram, "Give the people to me and take the goods for yourself." Abram said to the king of Sodom, "I have sworn to the Lord God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, that I will not take a thread or a sandal thong or anything that is yours, for fear you would say, I have made Abram rich. I will take nothing except what the young men have eaten, and the share of the men who went with me, Aner, Eshau, and Mamre. Let them take their share." The king wanted to get in on the act of blessing Abram too, just like Melchizedek did. He told Abram, "You can keep the gold, the silver, the livestock. You keep all the food. Keep the clothing. I just want my people back." They would rebuild together. Abram was entitled to everything else as a reward, really. And here is where Lot should have parted ways with Sodom. This should have been a wake-up call. But he came right back and settled in with these evil folks yet again. And within a few more chapters, Lot is literally going to have to be dragged out of that city before God's wrath is poured out on those people yet again. Seems like some people never learn. Abram actually seems to have learned something about receiving gifts that he didn't really need. Perhaps every time he saw the herds that he gained from his stint in Egypt, it's a painful reminder of his moral failure there. Ill-gotten gains really lose their luster once guilt sets in on you. I remember being in the 4th grade. One of my best friends had a toy that I wanted so bad. I remember it's one of those Transformer toys that turns from an action figure into this really neat desert dune buggy. Well, we didn't have the means for such a fancy toy when I was little, and I was just fixated on that. And I will confess to you, as time went on, I desired that toy more than I desired the friendship of my buddy. And obviously, because I stole it one day when everybody else was at recess. Yes, you're witnessing a confession that is 39 years past due. Once I had this toy in my possession, though, things weren't as great as I thought that it would be. I would try playing with it at home, and my mom recognized it as my friend's toy because I had been asking for one for months. So I lied and said that I borrowed it from him. As time went by, I could only enjoy this toy by myself with my door closed. When my friend came over, I took a lot of care to hide it from him, and I got worried every time he went near the place where I had it hid. and eventually the guilt overpowered any little bit of joy that this toy brought me, so I returned it to him secretly. He was so happy that he found his toy again, and I just sat there feeling like a total creep. Abram must have felt the same way looking at all these spoils he had gotten from Egypt. He's not about to take anything else from this Sodomite king as a reward too. First off, it wouldn't be a reward. He did what he did for his nephew. He didn't do this for Sodom. He didn't do it for Gomorrah or any of these other nations. He did it to get his nephew back. And second, it was obviously God that brought about the victory. That's why Abram gave a tenth to Melchizedek. Add to that, by accepting this so-called gift from Sodom, Abram would be morally obligated to this guy, and this guy would probably call him for help again in the future. Abram wisely declined even the smallest item from this king. He wanted no part of anything that they had to offer. The only thing that they took was the food that the soldiers had eaten, and anything else that the allies of Abram that come along wanted. They were allowed to take a reward, but Abram wanted nothing. Abram believed that God deserved the glory since God made this possible. But he's not going to impose his principles on his pagan friends. They're going to take what they want as the custom of the culture allows. But as for Abram and his servants, the meals that they ate from those spoils is sufficient compensation. In this study, we're going to see that Lot surrounding himself with evil men led him to receiving the same punishment that they did. But after Abram had spent some time with a great man of faith, this mysterious high priest, Melchizedek, he comes away a changed man. He is refusing things that he once accepted in Egypt not that long ago. He is now boldly declaring his faith and his integrity, and Abram is glorifying God. So we're starting to see now some of the man of faith starting to shine through. So we see how important it is that we surround ourselves from friends who are like-minded in the faith. And if you take a hot coal out of a burning fire in the fireplace and set it off by itself, it's soon going to cool off and it's going to ash over. But if you put it back in among the other coals, it's going to begin to glow and radiate once again. Remember that as you make choices in life every day as to the company that you surround yourself with, because it will have an effect on you, either good or bad.